would be brilliant throughout the show and afterwards. But first things first, I'd like to welcome my co-host, Karen Van Sweden.
Good evening, William.
Hello, how are you doing?
I'm good. Yeah, big news today in the northeast of Scotland, and that is there has been a rejection of the bid for the carbon capture and storage in the northeast in St Fergus. So yeah, that's the really big news today. So I immediately tweeted that I put the article up on my Twitter feed and said, well, would anyone like um, fiscal and monetary sovereignty? And that seemed to go down quite well on Twitter. I would guess with the independence community.
Yeah, yeah. No, it has been really interesting, and I know you've got a unique take on this because the Northeast is obviously struggling to comprehend this decision, but very kind of locally to you, this is actually seen as quite a good thing, isn't it? Do you want to kind of explain how that works?
Well, there is a move towards building over a park in an area called Torry. So I'm involved with that. I've gotten involved with the activists there. And for them, this has given them a little bit of time to work out what they're going to do because the problem with the energy transition zone is it's proposing to build over the top of this. It's actually a nature reserve. So it's a really special place and we want to preserve it.
Yeah, so that is an interesting take then. What I wanted to do was just kind of talk about this as an example of the situation which is possibly going to happen when Scotland's independent. And I kind of wanted to talk through a couple of scenarios. And scenario one is that the idea that Scotland, an independent Scotland, it's not monetary sovereign. So it continues with using the sterling up to maybe 10 years as the Sustainable Growth Commission. But I'd also like the viewers to think about Scotland using the euro because it's exactly the same. We're living as a currency user and not a currency issuer. So that's scenario one. And then scenario two was how would we do all this green infrastructure if we were monetary sovereign? So the first way to look at it is that if the Scottish government as an independent country wanted to create more green infrastructure, they had three choices really. This is if they're not monetary sovereign. The first one is to cut government spending in other areas. Okay, now that's not particularly popular, and obviously, if you think about it, government spending disproportionately goes to people who are the most disadvantaged in society. So that's not really something that anyone, certainly people who would create a new Scotland, would want to see happen. Now, the second thing that we could do is raise taxes. Now, if there's one way to sink a government, and if there's one way to sink up an independent, a brand new small independent country, it's to see a big increase in taxation. So we wouldn't be doing that. Now, the third option is that we would have to borrow, but we would have to borrow in a foreign currency. And that could be borrowing in dollars or yen or euros or sterling. But we'd have to borrow that and we would have to pay it back. And we would obviously have to pay back more than we borrowed. And the other thing, and Fidel Kabud has mentioned this to us, now we've spoken to him a couple of times, is that when you start owing debt in a foreign currency, your whole economy starts to shift and it starts to focus on ways to generate revenue in the currency that you owe a debt in. So Scotland would already kind of start moving away from the sovereignty that we would hope it had because the economy would have to shift slightly. Now, these are the only three ways that a country that's not monetary sovereign can come up with a lot of money to pay for green infrastructure. So that's scenario one. Now, scenario two is Scotland as a monetary sovereign country. And this means it has an amount of money, not a finite amount of money because it's our money, we're printing it. Different from using someone else's currency because you only have a finite amount because they've given you a certain amount of money. So we would have money, we would be able to pay for whatever we wanted using the Scottish currency. We wouldn't have to stop spending on other areas, we wouldn't have to raise taxes, and we wouldn't have to borrow in a foreign currency. because we would have a fourth option, which is effectively deficit spending, which is spending the money in our own currency and being able to do, and we can do what we want with that money up until a point where that money starts causing a problem and it leads into inflation. So Kieran and I would both really like you to think about those two scenarios, and we're going to come back to this because this is a perfect example of how life is different as an independent country with monetary sovereignty or using someone else's money as a user of a currency. Kieran, does that sound about fair, painting those two scenarios like that?
Yeah, I think it's important to also point out to the listeners as well that it's really down to real resources. You know, we have the people ready to do this work in this area; they're ready to go, and it's just a matter of money to pay them to make it happen. So, if you have those real resources in place and you just don't have the currency to pay them to do it, that's the problem. And if we were monetarily sovereign, we would be able to pay them to get cracking with this project. If that was the choice of the Scottish people, if that's what the choice that the government that they had voted in chose to do. So it's really about real resources. The currency is just a way of moving those real resources around, paying those real resources, which is in this case human resources that are standing ready to go. And it's if the real resources are in place, it is just tragic that we cannot go forward with projects like this because there's just no currency to pay the workers.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really important point that we want everyone to take away is that the currency is so much more than just the shape of it, color of it, or the little symbol that's in it. And when people say to you currency is not important, it is fundamentally, possibly singularly the most important thing to an independent country if it has monetary sovereignty or not. So that's a little bit of an introduction into some of the wonderful things that we've got coming up. Kieran, do you want to tell us a little bit about the show we're just about to, well, the video that we're just about to show?
So I'm very happy to say that we have Laurie Macfarlane as our guest this week, and he's actually our first Scottish economist. And oh my goodness, don't Scottish people talk fast? I listened to him this afternoon, and this is a really information dense interview. So Laurie is a research associate at University College London at the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose. And Laurie is a co-author of the book A Rethinking the Economics of Land and Housing, which was listed by the Financial Times as one of the best economic books of 2017. So, with great pleasure, I introduce Laurie Macfarlane.
Well, first of all, Laurie Macfarlane, thanks very much for joining us on SCOTONOMICS.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So, Laurie, the first question I want to ask you is actually a question in your book. Why are house prices in advanced economies rising faster than incomes and growth in the economy?
Thanks. Yeah, it's a very good question. And it's one of the questions that I think should be at the forefront of all our minds at the moment. So there's a number of things going on here, but firstly, I think we should dispel a myth that is quite common to hear among politicians and in the media. And that's that rising house prices are mainly a function of supply. So we've not built enough homes and therefore the price has gone up. And that's quite a compelling argument. You think it holds with most things. But when it comes to housing, for the most part, that's not really what this has been about. So if we go back in time, let's say over the course of the past sort of 40, 50 years, this is when the housing market's been quite radically transformed in this country and abroad. And if you look at what's happened, first of all, housing's become far more attractive as a financial asset. And the reason for that, there's lots of different reasons. But for example, in the UK, we had taxes on property quite significantly reduced beginning in the 1960s when the capital gains tax regime was introduced. Housing primary residences was made exempt, which is unique compared to other assets. So that automatically puts it at an advantage. Home ownership also became far more attractive compared to other forms of tenure, mainly because we basically stopped building council housing and sold off most of the stock. But we also deregulated the private rented sector and abolished rent controls. And that meant that private renting although it began to really quite explode, it became a very precarious way to live. And really the only way of getting secure housing was to enter the housing market, whereas previous years, decades gone by, you could get secure, affordable housing through council housing, through social housing. So that's one part of it, these kind of shifts. But probably the most significant one that's often overlooked is around financial deregulation. And so when we think about what it takes to buy a house, it's not just about how much your income is or how much savings you have. It's also about how much the bank is able and willing to lend to you. And it used to be the case gone by after the Second World War. It was mainly done by building societies, which were mutually owned, quite conservative organizations. You used to have to save a lot of money, and they'd be able to lend you money only under very certain conditions, and they'd only be allowed to lend you so much. And we saw the following the Big Bang in the UK and the massive deregulation that took place both before, but particularly during Thatcher. Banks basically were able to extend far more credit into the economy than they were before. And they were incentivized to become big players in the mortgage market. And so the idea, the textbook role of what banks do is that they take money from savers and then they lend it to businesses for productive investment. And that's just basically completely not true at all in the 21st century. What banks actually do is when they lend money, they actually create new deposits in the process of lending. And so they don't really lend to businesses anymore. It's not really that profitable for them. It's quite high risk. And so what we've seen is this explosion in mortgage credit over the course of the past 3-4 decades. And of course, that's meant that there's been a flood of new credit hitting the housing market into something that's been relatively static in supply, but we've seen this huge flood of mortgage credit. And we've had this sort of feedback loop create between, on the one hand, people taking out larger mortgages, that more purchasing power entering the housing market, then pushing up prices, that then meaning people need to take out even larger mortgages to get a foot on the housing ladder, meaning people have more debt, meaning house prices go up further. And this sort of feedback loop basically sort of going on and on, that's really sort of pumped up, fueled house prices in this country and elsewhere. At the same time, of course, we've had interest rates falling quite dramatically over the course of recent decades, which has also pushed up house prices quite significantly in this country and elsewhere. Of course, low interest rates is at the moment not just a UK phenomenon; it's a bit of a global one. So yeah, we've seen this sort of financial drivers of the house price boom has really been the most significant contributing factor to growing house prices. And of course, as soon as you have this expectation that house prices are increasing at this fast pace, double-digit house price growth, it creates an expectation that that's going to continue in the future, and it incentivizes people more to invest in property and invest in housing as opposed to invest in other things, because you're getting a better return doing that than you are in other things. And so people have got this idea in their head that they need to get on the property ladder because that's their nest egg for the future. We've also seen a dramatic erosion of pensions in the background, which has made people think even more about housing. And so we've got in this situation really, which is where housing, because of the dramatic explosion in house prices, housing has become the sort of primary, far more than 3/4 of that has come from rising house prices. It's not come from, investment, innovation, entrepreneurialism, all this stuff that the government likes to talk about. It's basically the price of a house going up. And really, it's the price of the land underneath the house that's driving that. And so when you think about it, nothing actually new and tangible is being produced. We're just seeing the price of land go up. That makes an individual wealthier, but it doesn't make society as a whole any wealthier, because that then has a cost that has to be borne either when that person sells the house and somebody needs to then pay more for it, or if they're going to rent it out, somebody will pay the price in higher rents. And so this sort of housing price explosion that we've seen, it really is a bit of a zero-sum game, where we've seen this enormous wealth accumulated by one group of people coming at the expense of this growing minority of people who've been completely locked out from that, who are now paying extraordinary sums in rents, or who are having to save up, unrealistic amounts to put down a very large deposit to even have a chance of getting on the housing ladder.
And capitalism isn't supposed to work like that. The gains are supposed to come from productivity. So we're supposed to be growing our economy because we're getting better at doing things. But what you're saying is our economy is growing because the price of land is going up, but there's no added value added to that growth in the economy. Is that a fair summary?
It is, yeah. I mean, we've seen, I mean, the UK, more than most any major country anyway, is really a prime example of a sort of rentier economy where rent extraction is the sort of primary mode of wealth accumulation. People are getting wealthy through extractive forms of activities like landlordism or home ownership. You know, that is when you're getting wealthy through home ownership. That is not, you know, like you say, it's not increasing productivity. It's a pure zero sum game. And we see this in other areas of the UK economy as well, like the financial sector, for example. Again, another very strong area is rent extraction, partly making it through house price inflation, because, you know, as you said, banks extending large mortgages, making lots of their money through mortgage lending and through, by extension, through land and house price inflation. And so that's very much the case. The UK is really the sort of the world leader when it comes to sort of having an economy based on rent.
To the chase with it, you know, you're not producing anything. Well, you're not doing anything productive.
The second part of your question in your book is because you've just highlighted all of the problems there. It's growth not linked to productivity. It's a zero sum game. So a natural extension of that would to be that politicians want to do something about it. So the question you ask in your book was, why don't politicians or policymakers want or allow house prices to fall?
Again, yeah, it's a very good question, and I think here we really need to get into the depths of, well, what's the sort of political economy of the housing crisis. You know, where are the sort of balance of power here? And really, when you think about it, there's an unholy alliance, really, of quite powerful interests of those who are doing very well out of the status quo. Now, that includes banks, as I mentioned, who are, you know, if house prices are rising, they're happy, they're making lots of money. It includes developers, private developers, who again are making money from rising house prices. But crucially, it also includes ordinary homeowners. And when you're in a country like ours, where still the majority of the electorate are homeowners, so the UK and Scotland, it's about 63% of households are homeowning households. And that's because that's been a political project, you know, to drive that up. It increased way beyond that, and then since house prices have just got so high, it's been falling for the last sort of 10 years plus, but it's still a majority of households. And so we're in a bit of a bind, because on the one hand, housing has generated a lot of wealth for homeowners. They are the majority of the population. For many of these households, that is the bulk of their own wealth is tied up in their house. And so, you know, any sort of politician that's coming in, are they going to want to do something that's going to actually undermine the wealth of the majority of the population? The other complicating factor comes back to the links to the financial system, because we have a situation now where basically the whole UK banking system is effectively lent against real estate prices in the UK, because mortgage lending is the main thing that they do. It also creates a very big financial risk, because if house prices were to tumble very quickly, that could have some quite significant damaging impacts on the banking system, you know, create various types of financial instability and potentially another banking crisis if it was severe enough. And so if you're a politician, you're thinking, okay, I want to speak to the majority of the electorate, therefore I have to pander to homeowner interests. At the same time, I really don't want to cause, you know, an economic or even look like I might sort of cause a financial crisis. And so it's very easy to see why politicians have done what they've done, which is basically pander to homeowner interests, pander to the banks, completely ignore the interests of private renters, and at least until recently in Scotland's in a bit better than the UK, not do enough on social housing as well. And so when you look at the balance, where the sort of balance of power lies in this country, it becomes a bit easier to understand why politicians aren't doing anything about this.
And no one wants to be in charge when they have to burst that bubble. And that's what seems to be the case, is that everyone knows that prices of housing can't just keep rising and rising, but you'd have to be a brave or foolish politician, or both, to actually try and do something about it. Again, you've spoken about politicians not wanting to do anything to bring down house prices substantially quickly, but surely by building more homes is a more transitional way to provide more supply and gradually reduce the amount of house inflation. Is that something we should be moving towards?
I mean, I think there is a need to build. I'm in favour of building more housing, but it's not really going to do much on the house price issue. I mean, even the government's own figures acknowledge this. I mean, in terms of new supply, because new builds make up such a small proportion of the overall housing stock, housing is a kind of a weird asset in the economy because it's the second-hand market that dominates prices. Usually, in most things, it's the price of new things that you're talking about prices, not the second-hand market. But housing is the second-hand market. Because even if you build, you need to build on an enormous, like an unbelievable scale for it to start to even have prices come down by 5-10%, which is still not that much. Now, in my view, I think we should be building more houses, and we should be building more affordable houses that are actually affordable in places where people want to live. But at the same time, we also need to be taking steps to sort of, as you put it, not crash the housing market overnight, because at the end of the day, that's only going to cause quite a significant economic crisis probably. And when that happens, it tends to be those who can afford it at least who suffer the most. And so I have a long-term strategic plan which says, look, because of the decades of completely irresponsible management of housing policy, we're in a really bad place. We need to get to a situation over the next 10, 15 years that really brings the housing situation under control. That's not going to happen overnight. We don't intend to try and crash house prices, but what we're going to do is gradually move towards a world where houses are, seen as somewhere to live, not as financial assets where there's huge amounts of money to be made. And that means that over a course period of time, we're going to be making changes to the tax system to make sure that there's not as much easy money to be made out of the property market. We're going to be looking at the mortgage market to try and basically redirect bank lending so it's not so much just flowing into the property market, but it's actually getting them to invest in the real economy productively rather than doing that. We're going to be looking at the way the remit of the central bank, because central banks basically historically have really ignored house price inflation and only focused on consumer price inflation, which obviously misses a whole part of the story. We're going to bring the private rental market into much tighter regulation. We're going to have much more secure tenancies. We're going to potentially look at things like rent controls as well. All of these different things together, whether it's tax, whether it's financial regulation, whether it's reform of the private rented sector, and indeed on new supply, building new homes where people want them that are affordable. All of these things together over time will sort of come, gradually sort of move to a position where we're not in this crazy world. But crucially, it's about setting expectations, because at the moment, because people have grown up in this world where house prices have council tax, which is, everyone agrees, is one of the worst taxes. It is a tax on property, but it's based on what the values were in 1991, before the big property boom even happened. And it's very, very regressive. And so we should absolutely be abolishing council tax, introducing either a pure land value tax or a progressive property tax that taxes land and the buildings in a way that's actually progressive and reflects contemporary house prices and is updated on a regular basis. That's an absolute no-brainer. We can't blame Westminster for that. We have full autonomy over that, and we just have time and time again failed to do that. So that's a big thing. We don't have control over things like capital gains tax. That's still reserved. We do have control over land and buildings transaction tax, which is what used to be stamp duty, which has been made a little bit more progressive, but probably more could be done there. In the private rented sector, of course, we could do a lot. We already have seen some changes there. We've now seen the Scottish Government and along with the Greens commit to rent controls. I think it'd be really interesting to see how that if that happens, and if it does, what that looks like, because that has, if done well, that could be incredibly powerful. If done badly or just done in a way that kind of doesn't really, dilutes it, it'd be a missed opportunity. So again, all these things that the Scottish Government can do. Obviously, what it can't do is when you're in the sort of macroeconomic or financial policy space, Scotland doesn't have much influence over the Bank of England at the moment, unfortunately. And similarly, when it comes to things like, banking regulation and, talking about what I was saying about the mortgage market, there's very limited stuff that the Scottish Government can do there. But it's not an excuse for inaction. There's plenty that we could be doing. and aren't at the moment. And so, yeah, I think we should be focusing in this Parliament about making some real progress here.
So, Laurie, I read your article for Jacobin magazine, The Unmaking of the British Working Class. And it was a painful journey for me to read through it, to really get the detail laid out chronologically as to what has happened in the housing market in this country since I was a teenager in the early 1980s. Possibly what's really important for our audience to understand, and this is near the bottom of your article, is that it's so important what infrastructure you have around property and how the whole community actually empowers someone who owns property to gain more from that property. So, for example, quite recently, I was involved in the Save Leith Walk campaign, and it was very clear that when that property was going to be taken over, the simply through planning permission, a landlord suddenly gains a massive amount of money. Centralisation of building infrastructure around certain areas, and I see this happening to a certain extent in Scotland as well. I think, do you want to say something more about that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's unique in many ways about the land market generally, and obviously that includes housing, includes other things, is that it's inherently there's a very much the value of it is inherently socially driven. So, the value of a plot of land, in the middle of a desert is worth nothing. But build a train station there, a university there, lots of housing, shops, cafes, theatres, all the rest of it suddenly becomes quite valuable, even though the owner of that piece of land could have just been, living somewhere else for that 30 years, come back, find himself, a millionaire. And certainly, throughout history, the debates of land reform, that principle about, well, who should actually be able to capture the uplift in the value of land that's socially created, who should get that? And of course, planning permission is a vital part of that here. And planning is something that's fully devolved, which I should have mentioned before, which we could be doing more of. And that question, who should capture the uplift in the value of land, has been absolutely crucial, absolutely core at the centre of land reform debates. And that basically got kind of lost. It was very, even right up until in Scotland and in the UK, right up until through the 50s, 60s, 70s, that was very much there. And it all just completely went by the wayside. And basically there was this acceptance basically that actually, okay, the uplifts in the value of land, whether that's from planning permission or whether that's just from stuff generally, that should just accrue to whoever the owner is. And we've created a policy environment where that's basically the default option. And I think that's it's not really right, but as we talked about, it's not really economically efficient either to have such huge wealth to be made just through rising land values. And so looking at ways in which we can capture more of the rising land values for the community, for the common good rather than for private gain is absolutely part of the solutions here. And partly that's about tax. I mentioned looking at a land value tax, which would do that. Partly it's about planning, reforming the planning system so that that when planning permission is granted, the public is capturing more of that uplift rather than right now where most of it's going to the state. And so there's lots of things that we could be doing here, but reinstating that general principle about rising land values being a common good that everyone should be able to share in and should be socialized to some extent. Regaining that as part of the policy discussion, I think, is vital, because that's just, as I said, in the UK context, that's just completely been lost over the course of the 4 decades, and that's partly why we've ended up in the serious housing crisis that we're in.
We're losing communitarianism through the acquirement of property, but also that through financialisation, both of property and things like the pensions market, etc., you're losing skill sets. And I saw that very acutely with someone who was doing a PhD in brain science who left that because they could make more money running cleaners to do Airbnb in Edinburgh. So you're having a brain drain essentially through over financialisation. Do you think that if we were doing things differently, this would give us a much more productive, more interesting economy and more robust through having more variety?
I think it definitely would. I mean, at the moment, because of the way that we've structured our economy, which is so geared, so biased towards property, towards real estate, what people do generally, if they ever get money or make money, is generally plow large amounts of that into the property market, into already existing assets, which as we've talked about, only adds to house price inflation. So the property market sucks up an enormous amount of the actual available capital for investment here, for something that is largely unproductive and isn't really adding any real value added to the economy. And so creating an environment where we're redirecting these financial flows away from property, that's, on the one hand, it's going to help sort of deflate the housing market, or at least make it not so financialized. But on the other hand, that then frees up money to do other things with. And I think part of the challenge is how do we sort of rewire financial flows in our economy away from real estate, away from these unproductive already existing assets, and to some extent things like shares. Actually, basically, when you're investing in shares, unless it's an initial public offering, you're basically just buying an already existing share that's been issued, that's just passing paper around. So instead of that, how can we actually channel funds into the things that are actually going to add real value to our society, to things like whether it's the green transition, decarbonisation, whether it's about local infrastructure, whether it's about public services, all this kind of stuff, the things that we actually need more of. And the potential wins, if you do that correctly, I think could be quite significant, not just in terms of tackling the housing crisis, but at the same time allowing other parts of the economy that should perhaps been held back to start to flourish.
Do you see a Conservative government, a UK government, taking any of these steps that you've outlined?
I don't, because their vote 100% depends on it, and they're fully aware of that.
And what about the Scottish government?
Well, it's a more interesting question. I think there's more potential to make some progress there. The Conservative Party across the UK is increasingly dependent on older voters, often retired, very, very high proportions of home ownership. And they are very hostile towards things like social housing, because they know that it creates the sort of it doesn't make people vote Conservative. And there was a classic quote actually from Nick Clegg when he was in government, when he said, in the coalition government, and he said afterwards that George Osborne would always say to him, "Why are you in favour of social housing? All it does is create Labour voters." So the Tories are very, very aware about how the property relations of the domestic environment affect people's voting patterns. In Scotland, it's slightly different. Of course, we have the SNP has quite a broad coalition of support. It's not just reliant on, elderly or older homeowners. And so I think the conversation about how we can have a more constructive discussion about solving the housing crisis, there's much more potential here at the moment. And we've seen we have seen some progress. Like I said, we are building more social housing. We are at least talking about things like rent controls. We have talked about tax reform. It's just the council tax. They've then decided not to do anything about it, which is a shame. But I think, the UK government is often introducing schemes like Help to Buy or the recent mortgage guarantee scheme, all of which is just designed to keep this show on the road for as long as possible, to keep this sort of feedback loop going into the property market. Because when house prices are getting higher and higher, more detached from incomes, the government's coming up with ever increasingly more innovative ways to keep that show on the road. And I think we'll continue to see this from this Conservative government, because they've got absolutely no interest in this coming to an end. Whereas in Scotland, we're still going to be impacted by that, because lots of these powers are reserved, but there is much more we can be doing in the meantime.
I read here in the local press as well that there's something like 500 million worth of property in Aberdeen lying empty. And I do wonder sometimes if some of it is just going to fall into so much disrepair that eventually it will no longer be an asset for anyone, because perhaps the owner has died, it's been passed on to a child, a nephew, etc., and they don't have the money to do anything with it, and eventually it won't be an asset at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a real risk, particularly somewhere like Aberdeen, which has been so, its prosperity has been very much rooted on a single commodity, i.e. oil and gas. And we know where this leads, because we only need to look at the various towns up and down Scotland and the rest of the UK that were former mining towns that, were there, the prosperity was there because of the mining. As soon as the pits closed, without any proactive strategy from the government, they fell into to basically decline. And you have many places, we hear all this, the dominant narrative of the housing crisis is that, house prices rising so much and there's not enough houses. There are many places around the UK, ex-mining towns, where the problem is there's so many empty houses, they can't get people to live there. Because of that, like you were saying. And I think there is a risk if we're not careful in Scotland that places like Aberdeen could go down a similar path. And I think that's why, slightly separate issue, but that's why we need to be very much talking about just transition and all the rest of it, to make sure that proactively steering the economy of the Northeast away from fossil fuels and oil and gas, and actually using these skills in other ways that are still going to be beneficial to the local economy.
Well, that feeds beautifully into the next area that I want to speak about, which was land, and also in the transition to a green economy. Now, how we use the land is going to be fundamentally important to how we transition to a green economy. What impact do you think it'll have on the green transition to green economy, and that so much private land is held in Scotland?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to be a really, really important issue. I mean, clearly, land is going to be absolutely vital. Land use is going to be absolutely vital in any decarbonisation strategy. And the problem in Scotland, of course, is that we do have one of the most concentrated patterns of land ownership anywhere in the world. Little less than, I think, 500 people own about half of it. And so what we actually need to do with that land is the control over that is very, very much concentrated in a handful of wealthy, normally often men, some of them who obviously don't even live in Scotland. And so I think for me, there is a real risk here, actually, which is that for many years, centuries often, these landlords have been able to profit from the ownership of Scotland's common land by not doing very much. And I think there's a real risk with the environmental. One variant of how we address the environmental crisis is that, we actually start subsidizing landowners to start doing things like planting trees or, rewilding or all this kind of stuff. So I'm all in favor of planting trees and rewilding. But if we're seriously saying, the way to do that is to pay, these private landlords who've been profiting for years, off the backs of, of the people, and now they're going to profit in a different way now, because we're going to say, we'll pay you to, do all these environmental sort of public goods. And so again, it's a very I think morally not right, but also economically not very efficient. And so I do think that the question of land ownership in Scotland is absolutely a vital one for a whole bunch of reasons, for democracy, for accountability, for justice, but increasingly also for environmental reasons, because there are huge tracts of land in Scotland that absolutely can be put to far better use than grouse moors or deer stalking, all this kind of stuff that huge tracts of land are used for at the moment, just so that landlords can make a quick buck. And so how we actually get to a much fairer, more democratic distribution of land ownership in Scotland, I think, is a question that I want to see really rising up the agenda in this coming Parliament. We've made some progress on land reform in Scotland, and that's great. Should be celebrated. It's good, but there's so much more that could and should be done. And again, a lot of this stuff is well within our devolved competencies to do it. And so I think this Parliament getting that question, particularly given that climate is now rising up the agenda and has risen up the agenda so much, that only adds impetus to an urgent discussion about Scotland's land ownership and how we can really break the grip of having huge tracts of land owned by a privileged few.
I'd agree. It's always been important, but it seems to be even more important. I mean, the idea, to build on what you'd said there, the idea that the government would give someone who owned vast tracts of peatland money not to dig that up is something that we would have issues with. But what is happening in Scotland? I don't know how. It's certainly a trend. I don't know how much is happening at the moment, but there is a trend that companies are buying parts of Scotland to plant trees. And we've recently had some discussions in the Scottish Parliament about this and how it's actually taking away ownership from the community, but also having a potentially negative impact because of, they're just building these kind of monoculture tracts of land. Any thought on how we can make sure that the land that's purchased in Scotland is used to transition to a green economy?
Yeah, well, I mean, there's lots of mechanisms that that have been talked about that should make it much easier to bring bring land ownership either into community ownership or to public ownership. So we've got the community right to buy in Scotland. That was great, good step forward. Of course, the problem with that is that when the communities are able to buy it out, they need to buy it at the market price, i.e., the hugely inflated price that's been inflated through all this stuff that we just talked about, which means that the landlord can then cash out. And he's quite happy, because often he's quite happy because he's just made quite a lot of money. And so I think looking at the community right to buy and looking at the compensation framework around that, because I don't think it's fair that actually it should be the market price, because the market price has obviously been dramatically inflated. There's also other mechanisms, so particularly around compulsory sale orders that were talked about before that we haven't seen yet, and also reforming compulsory purchase powers as well, to make sure that the state can actually purchase land at existing use value rather than what the land would be worth were it granted planning permission further down the line. So that's stuff that the mechanisms that we can do. But there's also a broader point here, which is on your point about companies buying up land to plant trees. That's absolutely true. And I think part of the problem here is because it's the way that companies and the government is looking at the net zero transition, when they're saying, actually, this idea that what we can do is we can offset, we can have negative emissions. As long as we're investing in negative emissions things, then we can continue to pollute. And so you have companies saying, oh, well, I'll plant trees, and that means that I can continue to pollute. And we're seeing this, quite a bit. And it's not a realistic solution to the climate crisis at all. There was a really interesting piece of analysis done by Oxfam recently, which if you look at the amount of trees that would need to be planted, to have any chance of offsetting our current trajectory, there's not enough space in the whole country. And so that's before you get to the sort of biodiversity elements of it, where we just have tracts of land being bought up with, like you say, a very, lots of sort of one type of tree, purely as almost a sort of marketing exercise for companies, so that they can say, oh, well, we've actually offset our carbon with these trees, and actually we're on our way to net zero. And so I think actually looking at the whole net zero framework and making it clear that, just relying on removing emissions through things like tree planting and technologies that haven't actually been proven yet is problematic in and of itself. And we really need to be looking at how we actually reduce our emissions and our environmental footprint in the first place, not trying to then extract it at the back end.
Yeah, well, the term is a sink, and currently the vegetation acts as a sink. But as everyone knows, with a sink, at some point it overflows. And, that's what's happened. You can't just keep expecting it to pull down all the carbon from the atmosphere. At some point, you're going to have to start putting less up there.
Massive, absolute no-brainer, both in Scotland, again, and everywhere, frankly, if we're going to get close to, even coming close to tackling the climate crisis, a huge programme of home retrofitting, of energy efficiency installations, is absolutely vital that it happens soon. And it's a win-win-win, because not only does it reduce emissions, it also reduces household bills for people. It also creates lots of jobs for people to do that. So it's really something that I think we could and should be ramping up, far faster than we are. And I know, in Scotland, obviously there's always constraints in the devolved financial constraints in the devolved settlement that wouldn't necessarily exist otherwise. But again, I think this is something that we could and should be doing a lot more of in Scotland.
Of course, if Scotland was independent, had its own currency, then it'd be able to spend much more of that money into the economy to do these types of. Scotland's a currency user, not the currency issuer, so it is limited. It has to a certain budget that it has to keep to. So these things are just beyond Scotland because of its role as a currency user and not an issuer. We spoke a little bit about the impact of inflation and the ability to have a home, be able to purchase a home and have somewhere secure to live. But there are a lot of other societal impacts that an increasing in house prices lead to. There's a lot of evidence to say that it's around obesity, how many children you have. It has a huge overspill into the economy. Have you got any thoughts on that?
Often it's interesting for me because I used to live in London for a while and then we moved back up. And, the housing crisis here is really bad. In London, it's just off the chart. And the circumstances that I was living in London were just awful. And many of my peers who still live down there, they're still sharing small flats between lots of people, often getting kicked out with not very good reason from landlords, all that kind of stuff. And yeah, it affects people's ability to make long-term decisions, because whether it's to like you say, have kids or anything else, if you're in an insecure home environment, or one which is precarious in some ways, then yeah, it has huge ramifications for all that kind of stuff. And that's why I think making sure that we have secure, affordable housing for everyone as a human right is absolutely, it should be at the core of any sort of vision for the economy. Because without that, then it's the kind of foundation upon which lots of other things flow.
We started speaking about productivity and how important that was for any economy to grow. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that when prices rise, the people who you need to do things like a plumber in your house can't afford to live near you because the house prices are so high. So you end up trying to do stuff that you've got no skills or qualifications for. And this is impacting businesses as well, who can't get, personal assistants or any other people in to support the business because the prices of housing is so high. So it has this huge knock-on factor, not just on society, but on the economy, which I find really interesting.
Yeah, and one of the sort of most extreme examples of that, I think it was in it was either Knightsbridge or Mayfair in London, so two of the most exclusive, expensive parts of London, where because house price inflation had just been, so out of control, it obviously attracted investment. Lots of these properties were getting bought up by overseas investors, for 20, 30 million pounds, snapping them up and not really actually living there, just getting it purely for the capital gain. And one of these, it's quite a famous street, I can't remember its name. Just over the years, restaurants have just started closing round about it, restaurants and shops, because these restaurants and shops rely on the local community to actually use their services. But because the crazy housing situation, the people that were buying them were in it purely to make money. They weren't even living there. And so there wasn't actually money being spent into the local economy. And so, as you say, it then actually has quite a negative impact on the health of the local community writ large, because the money's not getting spent.
Well, when we mentioned on Twitter that we were speaking to you, people were chipping in and saying, ask about the regulation in terms of buying homes in the United Kingdom. Can anyone just buy a home in the United Kingdom? And people were saying, well, you can't in Denmark, you can't in Singapore, you can't in Germany. And there was just a list of these countries. Is there any regulations to stop someone buying homes as assets in Scotland or the United Kingdom?
Not by standard default. No, I mean the UK is effectively as close a thing as you'll get to as a sort of property owner's paradise. Incredibly, the rules of the game, if you like, our legal system, our whole economic structure over many, many years have basically been designed to serve the interests of property owners. And so, yeah, I mean, lots of countries would look at stuff and the UK and go, what? How is that even allowed? I mean, you only need to look at the Pandora Papers that were released just last week, the latest tranche of, huge amounts of documentation showing all kinds of money laundering, tax avoidance type stuff by the global elite. Lots of that is going through the UK property market. You saw Tony Blair. I think he bought a property using an offshore entity to avoid paying tax. And so, yeah, you have these in the UK. You can buy property via an offshore entity that doesn't declare who the beneficial interest is of that. Which is just crazy. Which is why London is such a hotbed for money laundering. One of many reasons. And so, yeah, I mean, there's lots of things that I think we would, that in lots of other countries, they would look and they would go, that's crazy. Similarly with the pattern of land ownership in Scotland, they go, is that, but here we really, lots of people don't question it, take it for granted. And I think that's something that needs to change if we're going to make any progress here.
I think a lot of the things that you've highlighted for me today is that if Scotland does become independent, there's so many things that we have to change. than what currently happens in the United Kingdom. And I think this idea of grandfathering, when we become independent, that we start from a position of taking everything that happens in Westminster and then building our economy from there. I said all of the things that you've discussed today shows that that's probably not the best way for us to tackle a new country if we want it to be progressive.
I feel that over the past 40 years and the real drilling in of neoliberalism, that this feeling of precarity that has been created in our society once we were leaving the post-war settlement, essentially, that people see property as a safe place to keep their money. And do you think that perhaps if we could create in an independent Scotland somewhere that feels safe, then people could, for example, feel more comfortable about investing their spare money in something that might actually not give them a return?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, this comes back to the issue of security, which in many ways is the opposite of precarity. And so people are rightly concerned about, their future. But there are many people who are struggling to get by today. Even those who are doing okay today are worried about their future and how they're going to get by, in old age. And so, it's perfectly rational for people to think about things like that and invest in property. But again, for me, the best way to provide security in old age is to have a very decent, robust state pension system that provides that security there for everyone without having to worry about whether house prices are going up or down, or relying on volatile stock markets to provide that. But again, I mean, the pension in the UK, the state pension, the link with inflation was broken by Margaret Thatcher, so it was eroded over many, many, many years to the point where it's among the lowest relatively among advanced economies. And that's starting to creep up a tiny bit with the triple lock, but it's still, on comparison to other countries, the state pension is just meager. It's a measly sum of money that doesn't provide enough of that security. And so people are thinking, well, will I get on the one property, or will I get in the buy-to-let market? Will I do this and that? Will I invest in these other things? And having that security of knowledge that in old age should be provided for, ideally with care, which is a whole other issue as well, which we won't get into, that kind of stuff, then it does free up people to think about, well, actually, how can I, what else can I do today? Creative things, get involved in the community, all that kind of stuff. Having that financial security, is really a sort of a bedrock, I think, for unlocking people's potential. And sadly, that I think in recent decades, we've put people in more precarious positions, which basically, contains and deprives people from reaching their potential.
Almost everything that we've done since the 80s seems to have been to create this perfect storm with house price inflation. And as you said, the whole economy has been geared towards landowner. And at some point, this has got to come home to roost. And I hope that when we're talking about and looking forward and planning an independent Scotland, we realise that we've got to take a different route from what's been the route of the Westminster government. Well, Laurie, it's been amazing having you on. You've given us so much stuff around housing and land, and we're really grateful for that. So thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Pleasure.
Oh, I'll just bring Kieran back on. There you are again.
Hi.
So any thoughts or your summary of what was an incredibly in-depth and detailed 45 minutes there covering land and housing? What's your thoughts?
Yeah, a couple of things right at the start. The myth of bank lending and how money is simply double entry bookkeeping, both bank broad money and central bank base money. You could see that when the gold standard was dropped in 1971, that the banks would eventually see that they could do the same thing as the central bank was doing, because money is obviously not backed by a precious metal and hasn't been since 1971. And the other thing right at the end that was really interesting was that loss to society through precarity. So we not only have a loss of productivity where nothing really useful is being made, or not as many things as could be, and also just how that precarity is really having a very negative effect on our society.
Yeah, we had some really good comments on the chat there, and I think it is just trying to say to people that when we have these discussions about housing and land, it's not just about homeowners renting mortgages. There's so much of a spillover uh, into society, and I really liked Laurie's point about you can see a little fly in my hair there. At Laurie's point about pensions. And I think, again, too often we don't think about what people are putting their money into. And really, pensions, a much stronger pension, is much more likely to move people away from seeing a home as an asset. But at the moment, when it's such a meagre pension in the United Kingdom, I think it's the lowest in the G20, then this has to be an option for people, and you can't criticise anyone for looking at their home or even other people's homes as a way to secure their future, because there's not many other ways to do it. And as you said there, if you don't have a really secure job, then again you're looking at something much more secure, which is housing. So again, on the chat we had a lot of issues around supply. Build more houses, take land from this person, build some more houses there. But this is all the supply side, and I just kind of wanted to highlight what Laurie said. He said, yeah, it's great, but there's 25 million homes in the UK. So to have an impact on the prices, you got to add a couple of million homes, and that's going to take decades to build. So we've got to start looking at the demand side rather than just the supply side. So some really, really good comments in the chat. Thanks for them, and keep them coming. Any other thoughts or final thoughts, Kieran?
I just think you made a really good point. There's just this route that we've gone down for the past 40 years or so. There's just no added value, and it's not to say that there isn't any at all, but it's just there's added value has just been negated by this course which the UK government has followed.
Yeah, your point about the kind of financialisation, that people are leaving really good jobs in research or industry to go and set up so that they can earn money from a profession that adds no value to the economy. I think it's a really, really a really good way to look at this. As I said, these issues that are much more than just the price of the house.
Yeah, I mean, I had read about that, and then I actually sat down with someone a few months later who was actually an example of that. Someone who was doing a PhD, and they left that PhD. They could have been curing all kinds of brain cancers, but no, they decided to set up a business to clean Airbnb flats instead because it was better paid.
And as we say, absolutely no, you can't have any issues or problems with people that who do that. We've really got to try and construct a society where people don't feel that they're forced to do that, so that they've got some kind of future, a secure future to look forward to. Well, what I'm looking forward to, see what I did there, is the next episode of SCOTONOMICS, and it's SCOTONOMICS episode 12, and it's not in 2 weeks' time, it's in a week, so you don't have to wait as long for the next one. We've got a really, really interesting conversation with Claudia Sam. So famous is Claudia Sam that there's the Sam rule. So once you're done here, have a little Google and see what the Sam room is. The Sam rule is, and we're really lucky to have a conversation. Sam was, I think she was a former section chief at the Fed, and we've got loads of questions about the Fed and central banks, so that's really, really good. And then the following week starts our Road to COP26 series. And did you notice that Ben Franta was in the news today, Kieran?
I didn't.
Yeah, so we're interviewing Ben Franta, and we had a wonderful conversation with him last week. He wrote a paper which was entitled Weaponizing Big Oil Delay and Climate Delay and Denial, and he's actually just co-authored a similar report which looked into the French company Total, and it was just launched today, so there's been a lot of press coverage on that, and it was Total knew burning its oil caused climate change way back in 1971, but they remained publicly silent till 1988. Then they started to promote doubt. Then in the 90s, they opposed any kind of control over fossil fuels. So we're really lucky to have an episode with Ben next week. And he also mentions one of our favourite people, Sir Ian Wood, who was in the news again this week, being asked what his opinion was on carbon capture, because obviously he's an expert on carbon capture because he's a oil tycoon, so of course he would know about all these other things, nothing to do with exploration or drilling of fossil fuels.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that interview with Ben, and I'll be looking to that paper now that you've told me about it.
Yeah, it's really good. It's similar to the one that he did in the States. Alex Thompson from Channel 4 News had a few tweets. You can find it there. Well, that's us done our hour tonight. I hope you've enjoyed the show. And we think that housing and land are crucial areas for us to look at as we try and plan a new Scotland. But certainly we want to pushing you towards this understanding of the importance of a Scottish currency and monetary sovereignty. Well, that's enough from me for tonight. Kieran, take it easy, and everyone at home, I'll see you soon.
Good night, everyone.